Welcome to the Rock's Backpages podcast. My name is Barney Hoskins and I'm in London in the ongoing heat wave with my colleagues Jasper Mearson-Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
And William Pike.
Hi, Barney.
And joining us all the way from Chile, Brazil, no less, is Mr. Geoffrey Cannon. Welcome, Geoffrey.
Very cold here.
That just feels all wrong, that we should be sweltering. And
completely backwards.
Freezing. Yeah. For anyone not steeped in the history of music journalism, Geoffrey was the very first regular rock critic for a UK national newspaper. He wrote a weekly column for The Guardian between 1968 and 1972, while also contributing to Melody Maker and The Village Voice and even Oz. We have over 100 of his groundbreaking pieces on Rock's Backpages, and in this episode we're going to touch on some of them and listen to a couple of clips from an audio interview with Jack Bruce. Geoffrey, why don't we start with Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, because in your one of your wonderful prefaces that you've written to your old pieces, you imply that Why Do Fools Fall in Love was a kind of epiphany for the 16-year-old Geoffrey Cannon. Is that reasonable to say?
Yes. I was at school at Christ Hospital in Horsham, Sussex, and occasionally a couple of us would go to the local record shop and listen to sounds which were recorded in cubicles. And my colleague put on Why Do Fools Fall in Love, and I was completely enchanted.
As you should have been. This is a rather magnificent record, isn't it? From another intro that you wrote to an unpublished 1965 piece titled From Pop Singers to Rock Bands, you talk about the impact of records like Why Do Fools Fall in Love, also Smokestack Lightning, Blueberry Hill, Jenny Jenny, and Elvis's Don't Be Cruel. You say these had emancipated you at that age, and you say, I felt them inside me and I still do, but writing about such music to describe what it was and to explain what it meant was something else. As far as I knew then, there were no maps. It was uncharted territory. Pop journals were no help. In those days, they were fan mags. So I guess my next question for you would be, when did you start to think about writing about pop music and how to write about pop music? How did that come about?
It came about because originally I was interested in mass communications generally for New Society. And then I moved to The Listener, which Carl Miller edited.
Yes.
And talked and raved about rock and roll, as I called it then. And he said, write about it. And I said, oh, I can't do that. And he said, yes, you can. So I did. And I wrote 3 pieces for him, which were unsatisfactory in that I wrote them as if they were book reviews. And then I thought, well, what is the right way of writing about rock? Which was unclear to me and really unclear to everyone else. And what I realized is that rock is a medium of itself and requires a vocabulary and a way of writing which is new. And that's what I explored in The Guardian, which I then joined later.
What kind of influence on you were people like Colin McInnes and very differently like Susan Sontag? Because I know that they played a part in how you began to write.
Well, Colin in particular, because he was the author of Absolute Beginners, but also I introduced him to Tim Raisin, who was editor of New Society. And he gave me scope to bring in other people, and Colin was the one I brought in. And of course, he wrote about rock and roll very early on, and I got to know him as a friend, and he was very influential, particularly Colin.
By the time you'd moved on to The Listener, which obviously was a BBC journal, and that was in 1967, you were writing remarkably about not just the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and others, but about the Velvet Underground and the Mothers of Invention. I mean, this is 1967 in Britain. I mean, that is an extraordinary thing to me. I understand that groups like that were being written about in the underground press, but you were writing about them in The Listener and then in The Guardian. How do you recall this sort of pretty rapid evolution of popular music from kind of Mersey beat and sort of teen idols to, groups like the Velvets and the MC5?
Well, the change was originally from pop music to rock and roll, and then to rock music, and then specifically what we all talk about now, rock. And those seem to be just a sequence of names, but they're not. Rock music and rock was quite different from popular music.
I was unaware of the difference between rock music and rock. Is that what you just spelled out? Were they two different things?
I think so, yes. There's not a lot of difference between the two, but there's a big difference between those and pop music and rock and roll. And what I developed in my thinking was that rock music or rock is a medium, like Marshall McLuhan discusses media, and needs to have its own language.
You knew Marshall McLuhan, didn't you?
Very well, yes. I visited him at his home in Toronto about 4 times, and he visited me and stayed at my house in London once. And I said to him, why is it that in all the examples you give of what you're talking about, you never mentioned rock music? You mentioned advertising, for example, and all kinds of things that normally weren't taken seriously, but you never mentioned rock and roll. And he said, well, first of all, I suppose I'm too old, but also I don't know anything about it. And then he said, you do it for me, which I did.
Roughly how much older than you was Marshall McLuhan?
About 20 years.
About 20 years older, right. And The Medium is the Message had come out in the early 60s?
No,
was
70s.
That came out in the 70s. The Gutenberg Galaxy came out in the early 60s. Is that correct?
Yes, that is his most important work.
Yes.
Because there he describes his theory, which he developed in the later book, and gave lots of examples of media that justified what he was saying. But as I said, he never mentioned rock and roll, and he admitted that was an omission.
It's interesting to me that you were thinking about it in these terms of, media studies, and as Barney mentioned, the phrase "the medium is the message," as coined by Marshall McLuhan. And rock music, rock and roll, had a certain extension into public life as being something that could have a corrupting influence. And I wonder whether you felt at the time that you needed to contribute to the discourse in a way that might correct that, as being as you liked rock music and rock and roll. Did you feel that you needed to kind of defend it from criticism in that way?
No, because except that I wouldn't say it was criticism. It was part of its joy.
Was the fact that a songwriter like Lou Reed, that he had obviously read literature, and his lyrics were, obviously more poetic and more, I would guess you'd say, kind of intellectual than a lot of the pop music lyrics of the earlier era, however great those were. Was that something for someone like you you'd been to Balliol College, probably the brainiest of all Oxford colleges. Were you attracted to songwriters like Lou Reed on a kind of artistic, intellectual level?
Intellectual, yes, because roughly speaking, until the Velvet Underground, what started to become rock music was largely to do with sentiment, love, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that's irrelevant, but what Lou Reed did was, with Andy Warhol, was to establish in his first album, which importantly was produced by Andy Warhol, that rock could be about anything. And that was a tremendous emancipation. And as somebody once said, that maybe the first album was only listened to by 30,000 people, but all of them went off to start a band.
Yes, absolutely. Or start something interesting, kind of culturally anyway.
Did you feel aware of how important the Velvet Underground and Nico, the debut Velvet Underground album, was when it came out? Or did it take some time for you to acknowledge the difference in writing style from purely sentiment to something a bit more broad?
No, it was immediate. It was immediate when I first heard it. It was a revelation, as I said. But it wasn't a matter of writing style. It was a matter of what could be done in rock music and what, in effect, defined rock music. And the Velvet Underground just opened so many doors.
Maybe the choice of his fate set themselves out upon a platform to choose. What had he to lose? Not a coast bloody country all covered with sleep, where the black angel did weep. Not a no city street in the east.
If we sort of switch coasts from the east coast of the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed to the west coast of Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, one of the pieces that we're going to feature on the homepage is your listener review of the Mothers' Freak Out album, the first album by the Mothers of Invention, and also Absolutely Free. So you're reviewing both those records. And I mean, it just so happens that Freak Out is just a couple of weeks over 60 years old. It was released, hard to believe when you go back to it, released in July, or at least the summer of 1966. It's pretty radical for its time. I just wanted to quote from the RBP intro that you wrote to that omnibus review of the two Mothers albums, because it really charmed me. You say, "Picture me, please, in my room within Overstrand Mansions, Prince of Wales Drive, Battersea, facing the park, in a flat with a wife, 3 children, and a marriage I needed to leave, between 2 and 6 in the morning, fluctuating from the family finances to what Frank Zappa was, capital letters, really all about." I love that idea. Your children are asleep and you're working on a review of the Mothers of Invention in the small hours of the morning. Can you take us back to that?
Well, Frank was, of course, a genius, and he had as big an influence on rock and roll as we discussed before. Again, he was an example of someone who opened doors to so many other people. And in his case, just like with the Velvet Underground, there was this influence of classical music. Yes. Frank Zappa was a classical musician, as well as being a rock and roller, and as well as having an outrageous personal style. I went to Italy to hear him speak at a RAI conference on the future of rock and roll, which he joined, and I joined, and Colin McInnes joined, and a lot of other people joined, and went to interview him in his hotel room. Wonderful man, and also very generous.
Fascinating.
Mr. America, walk on by your schools that do not teach. Mr. America, walk on by the minds that won't be reached.
So not only were you writing about all this revolutionary music, Geoffrey, but you were also co-producing films for Granada Television in cahoots with writers like David Dalton, who was also a guest on this podcast before he died in 2022. Can you tell us specifically how the Johnny Cash at San Quentin film came about?
Well, how that came about is that a group of us, like with David Dalton and John Cott, were hired by Joe Durden-Smith of Granada Television to do rock shows. And the Bernstein brothers, who ran Granada, gave us permission. And in the case of Johnny Cash, having reviewed him twice for the listener, I came into the office one day and said, I've got a terrible idea. Let's do Johnny Cash at Folsom again. And my colleagues agreed. And I rang up Saul Holliff, who was Johnny's manager. And he said, that's impossible. But Johnny's going to San Quentin. You can join us there. And I came into the office and said, this is wonderful news. Johnny Cash at San Quentin. What a combination. And it turned out that album, which we featured in our hour-long show, became the content of Johnny Cash's very first number one record. And Saul said to me, if it hadn't been for Granada Television, that album would never have happened.
Right. Extraordinary. How wonderful to have played a part in
Incredible.
any part in Johnny Cash's career.
And of course, I was totally ignorant then, because I had the impression that Johnny Cash was just a musician for country people. And I had no idea that he and Dylan were great friends. And Dylan was actually present at Johnny's death.
Geoffrey, how did you become The Guardian's first full-time rock critic in 1968? And supplementary question, were you influenced in any way by the knowledge of Richard Goldstein's similar role at the Village Voice? In other words, did you know that Richard was like the full-time rock critic at the Village Voice?
Well, I began to know about that, but as far as The Guardian is concerned, I visited Peter Preston, who was at Oxford with me, who was then features editor of The Guardian, and said, what you need is a rock critic. And he said, good idea, and hired me. And of course, I had no idea then that I would be writing a weekly column for 3.5 years. And as you mentioned, I was the first critic ever in the UK to write regularly for a UK national newspaper.
Did that feel like a daunting task for you when you joined The Guardian and had your rock column?
I think a lot of us who were making the moves in the 60s were all, if in your terms, were all arrogant. I felt it was quite a natural progression for me. and everything, a lot of things that are very difficult now felt very easy then. And a reason for that is the whole ethos of the 60s was that it was the young were taking over, not only taking over as writers, but also taking over as managers and directors.
Sounds like it was a good time to be alive.
I mean, obviously and famously, William Mann had written about the Beatles in the Times as early as 1963, I believe. And also there were people like George Melly and Tony Palmer and one or two others who were occasionally writing about rock.
Well, that's the word. They were doing it occasionally.
It was occasionally.
I was doing it regularly. And that, of course, was a challenge to decide what to write about every week.
Yes, absolutely.
What was your preferred methodology for meeting that challenge? Would you just listen a lot? Were you going out to see things? I mean, I know that you just wrote that you preferred the North American bands. But
the answer to your question is both. The listening like all night to new records, and aided by the publicity managers of rock and roll bands, but also more and more going out and listening to concerts, not only in the UK, but also in the USA. That was the big influence on me. Listening, for example, just before I finished at The Guardian, listening to Elvis at Madison Square Garden was an extraordinary experience.
Wow.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right with you. That's all right, Mama. Just any way you do it, that's all right. That's all right.
Given everything that was happening in sort of swinging mid-60s London, Geoffrey, we thought it might be fun to tie in the week's new audio interview with this episode's themes. And given that it's 60 years since Cream played their very first gig at the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, 29th of July, 66, we've just added a Jack Bruce interview to RBP's audio archive, and Jasper's going to tell us a bit about it.
Certainly. So the interview is Pete Makowski interviewing Jack Bruce in 2008 about his career and lots of the people that he worked with, and that includes Graham Bond in the Graham Bond organization, and Graham Bond's Jack Bruce talks about Graham Bond's explorations of the occult and inheriting various strange objects like a pentagram pendant and Peruvian axe, sort of artifacts like that, as well as John McLaughlin being broke and joining Bruce's session as a way to get paid before joining up with Tony Williams and Miles Davis. And then he touches on McLaughlin's sort of musical transformation after taking up meditation with Sri Chinmoy. He talks about writing the music for Theme for an Imaginary Western. And of course, he talks about the very first time that he and Ginger Baker played with Eric Clapton at the Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival in August 1965, when Jack and Ginger were playing with Graham Bond and Eric was playing with the Yardbirds. So we're going to listen to this clip now.
So it was a big jam session. I think there was all sorts of people involved. I seem to remember Jimmy Page, certainly Graham Bond, Eric Clapton, God, you name it, we're all there. That was the first time I played with Eric, and I was very impressed with him then. And then he started coming down to a few of our gigs, and checking us out with Graham Bond, and I used to sing a couple of songs with Graham as well. And then I remember, something was happening. There was some talk to me, John and John Mill or something. But then I was on the Blue Boar, on the motorway in the M1, which is the big truck stop there. I remember sort of Eric walking in. I got so excited. I was eating my dinner, right? I'm going to try out. And Eric walked in. I went, Eric, and I picked up this plate and I chucked it at him.
Why?
I don't know. This sort of thing you do when you're mad.
I love the way Pete, who was a very dear soul, we lost a few years ago, the way he just goes, why? Which I think is a very reasonable question to ask.
Yeah, it's very funny. Jack Bruce seems quite pleased that he's probably the only musician ever to be banned from the Blue Boar on the M1. It's quite amusing.
Brilliant.
But he goes on to talk about jamming with Hendrix, when Hendrix plugged into Bruce's Marshall stack to play Killing Floor at the Regent's Polytechnic. And he's very amusingly deprecating about Pink Floyd, describing them as a band for people who don't like music. But he also talks about Leslie West of West, Bruce and Lang, and goes into the 70s and the influence of drugs. And that's what the second clip is about. So let's have a listen.
Well, what can I say about that? It was a band. It was an experience. It kind of, the most I can say about it is it disintegrated in a welter of smack, really. Unfortunately, that was the time when those things were really happening. The 60s were really innocent and nice and romantic. The 70s were a bit heavier and more serious. There was certainly a lot worse drug use going on by me.
Yeah. Do you think that was the theme anyway? It seemed to sort of capture everyone.
Yeah, it seemed to be. I mean, people always talk about the 60s and drugs. Yeah, there was a lot of, it was acid, and there was a lot of casualties of that. And there was a lot of dope smoking, which I don't remember too many people really being screwed up behind that.
It was man drugs.
It was man drugs. But I always think of that as the 70s as well, really.
Yeah.
Certainly man drugs and stuff like that, yeah. But, there was the real heavy smack.
I wondered if that resonated with you, Geoffrey, in any sense that Jack Bruce there, if you could hear it clearly, was talking about the difference between the 60s, and there was a kind of innocence still in the 60s. And then in the 70s, that innocence seemed to have kind of dissipated and very heavy drugs were coming in.
Yes, I think drugs had to do with it, but also what had to do with it was death.
Right.
There was, for example, Altamont. But then after that, the deaths of all aged 27 of Morrison, Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix. And I think that changed. That was one of the factors that changed the mood. But also the music changed. So I think, for me, apart from Bruce Springsteen, who I would celebrate, I think there were very few musicians after the 60s who were infused by the joy of the 60s. And one of the reasons was that so many heroes were young. They were the same age as the audience.
Mm-hmm. You went on the Stones' 1972 tour of America. And then not long after that, you more or less stopped writing about rock and you left The Guardian. I wondered if there was something about the changes that were happening, the scale of tours like that, and then, things like the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young tour of 74, where it just became quite bloated and quite decadent, and the people were suddenly making huge amounts of money. And I wondered whether if any of that was disenchanting to you and played any sort of part in your moving away from writing about rock.
Yes, there were. When I started, there were very few bands worth listening to. When I ended, there were lots and lots of them, and I realised that I was incapable of covering the whole field, which of course The Guardian does now. But also, I had a full-time job as editor of Radio Times, which was then, believe it or not, the biggest circulation magazine in Europe. And to combine that with trying to cover the whole ground was impossible.
Who took over from you at The Guardian, if anyone immediately did take over from you?
Nobody took over from me in the sense of being a regular writer, but I think Robin Denslow was writing. He started to write at the same time, more or less at the same time as I stopped. Peter Preston succeeded in making The Guardian attractive to young people, and of course the number of writers writing about rock now is about half a dozen.
Yes, there probably are 6 writers on The Guardian. I I'm interested I am a Guardian reader and have been for many years, typical left of centre metropolitan elitist. But I wondered, when you were writing about music for The Guardian, was the readership sort of comparable to culturally and class-wise, etc., to The Guardian's readership now? Of all the broadsheets, would it have been naturally the one that most quickly embraced the idea of a weekly music column?
Well, yes, but not because it was The Guardian, but because of Peter Preston and Michael McNay. Peter Preston took over as features editor and then became editor, of course, and they were determined to make The Guardian the most attractive newspaper for young people, which they succeeded in doing. And I'm sure that my column was one factor in that.
Yes. You edited the huge selling Radio Times, as you say, for a decade, from 69 to 79. One of the things I love on your Wikipedia page, Geoffrey, is the quote from Elkan Allen, and I won't try to explain who Elkan Allen was, but he griped that the Radio Times was full of, quote unquote, peripheral and tangential articles, frequently of a trivial nature. Was that something you actually took pride in?
Yes. He attached my name to that criticism, and I thought, well, sod him.
Obviously, my parents got the Radio Times in that era, so I would look at the Radio Times. Did you deliberately try to make it more than a guide to what was on telly?
Yes. My line was that Radio Times in print would be the equivalent quality of the BBC in television and radio, and so that meant, as well as being part of the BBC, we were also independent, which was a line that was accepted by Hugh Weldon, who was managing director of BBC Television, who hired me, or in effect was the most important person who hired me, and became more or less aggravated more and more people in the BBC who thought that we were being too arrogant. And eventually Alistair Milne, who I abominated, became managing director of BBC Television, and was one reason why, happily, I left Radio Times and joined the Sunday Times.
And at the Sunday Times, your focus became on like health and nutrition issues and running as well. So these were, well, quite different from Frank Zappa and Lou Reed, shall we say, who didn't have that much to do with health and nutrition. Although I will point out, Frank Zappa didn't really do drugs. He just observed lots of other people doing drugs. Among your books, Geoffrey, was 1987's The Politics of Food, which provoked an anti-nanny state tirade from the late Bernard Levin. So tell us about, in those years, many years when you were really focusing on those subjects and those sort of areas of society, were you still engaged with music and paying attention to what was happening in popular music?
Not much, no. As you say, I changed my field. And in fact, the first book I wrote as a result of working for the Sunday Times was Dieting Makes You Fat, which became a number one bestseller. And that led on to The Politics of Food and got me involved in that topic, which I'm still involved in Brazil.
What led to your move to Brazil in 2000?
Well, I felt more and more that the West was not the place to be, and the place to be somewhere in the world was the South, which would mean either China or India or South America. And I chose South America partly because I then had a love in my life who was Brazilian. And that was the immediate prompt. But also, I just felt that the future was in the South, which I firmly believe. And so Brazil became my adopted country, which it's been since the year 2000. Had
you been listening to Brazilian music? Is that something that you started listening to when you moved? What are your favorite things among Brazilian music? Well,
I actually started when I was influential in starting the Glastonbury Festival. That in those days there were Brazilian musicians in London who had left because of the military regime. That was Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil. Both played at the 1971 Glastonbury Festival, right, which was the most important of all the Glastonbury festivals, in my opinion. And also, incidentally, that was the first important date for David Bowie.
And you saw them play there, and you saw Bowie play there?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. So the whole Tropicalia thing was something that you were aware of as early as 1971. And was it something you then kind of picked up again when you moved to Brazil?
Yes, and there were other bands, there were other musicians as well. But yes, the Os Mutantes, who were the band of Tropicalia, and were an example. And as I say, Veloso and Gil.
And before we started recording, you mentioned that the area of Brazil that you live in is where Milton Nascimento is from.
I'm not sure he was from there, but he was certainly from Minas Gerais, our state, and he now lives in my city, which is called Juiz de Fora.
Have you met him? Have you seen him perform?
No.
Okay. There's still time. How wonderful, though. We're all great fans of that sound of music.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much wonderful Brazilian music. I mean, within the sort of umbrella of MPB, Música Popular Brasileira, there's so much great stuff.
By the way, the Brazilian musician I most admire is Belchior, who's not often mentioned as a big deal, and he's my favourite Brazilian musician, and I did see him play.
Wonderful.
In Brazil or in
Europe?
Yes.
Interestingly, he was one of these musicians who had other professions. He was a surgeon.
Huh.
Presentemente eu posso me considerar sujeito de sorte, porque apesar de muito moço, me sinto são e salve forte.
So my final question, I can't speak for the others, but would be this: that, I mean, do you look back? I think I know the answer, but do you look back on your years of writing about music with pride and affection? And how do you regard the sort of subsequent evolution of music journalism to the extent that you paid attention to it? I mean, what would you say is your legacy in terms of music journalism?
Well, I think the 1960s was the time. And of course, I would say that because that was when I was writing about it. But I think that the development of it as a medium, as I said, involving in the Marshall McLuhan sense, was evident in the 60s. And afterwards, I think it's degenerated into being more like it was in the olden days. It is much more about emotion, much more about love, which is fine. There are exceptions to that, of course, but generally, I think the music is much less interesting than it was in the 60s. And a whole number of things, of course, these days are less interesting than they were in the 60s. One singer and band that I do rate very highly, of course, is Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. They are of the quality of the bands in the 60s, and also political. Somebody wrote recently in Brazil that the one thing that will get Lula re-elected will be for Springsteen to go on tour now and promote Lula. And no other band could have that influence.
Yeah. How often does Bruce play in Brazil?
I'm not sure that he has.
Oh, really? He must have played some vast show in Rio de Janeiro, I'd have thought.
Probably.
Yeah. So the last order of business is for my colleagues to tell us about a few articles that they've added or overseen that have gone into the Rock's Back Pages library. So I don't know which of you wants to start. And Geoffrey, feel free to comment if the mood takes you. But
yeah, I can start. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Geoffrey. It's great to have you. My first piece is by Rosalind Russell for Record Mirror on the 22nd of July, 1978. And she's reviewing Plastic Bertrand's debut album, self-titled, with Ça Plaint pour moi on the album, which was a hit the year before. And she says, "He's such an engaging soul. I really hate to put him down. He's charming, off the wall, and mimes with such a delightful disregard of synchronization. Plastic must be the smoothest young heartthrob to step across the channel. He's certainly the only Continental I've ever enjoyed watching, and the only one to break away from the Claude Francois syndrome. However, it has to be said that Plastic has made a bloomer. While Ça Plaint pour moi still has a great attraction, a whole album in the same genre is somewhat tiring. In fact, I'd go so far as to say young Bert has gone over the top. He appears to have rushed into this venture with the intention of cashing in on his hot current market value." And I just thought this was quite funny because I do love the song Ça Plaint pour moi. But the idea of a whole album in the same style, I haven't yet listened to it actually, might get a bit much for me. So I thought that was
okay.
Fun.
Bit of a one-hit wonder, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Ça plane pour moi. Ça plane pour moi. Ça plane pour moi, 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 moi. Ça plane pour moi.
The second one is from Mark Helen in Word Magazine from January 2004. And this is a very long feature where he interviews Jules Holland, and it's called All Back to Jules's. And it starts off in media res with a quote from Jules saying, "So anyway, we're on stage playing and I look up to the balcony. All the leaders of the Western world are there. The G8 summit. incredibly tight security. You're practically strip search. Glove up your ass before they let you into the place. Protesters outside, of course, all the standard stuff. Up in the balcony, the unforgettable world leaders. The Clintons, the Blairs, the Chiracs, the disgraced vodka-drinking guy, which is Yeltsin, I think, the Spanish one, the Japanese one, some chap from Italy. Unforgettable people. They're all there. We go into All You Need Is Love at the end, and Jacques Chirac leaps to his feet. He thinks it's his national anthem. So, of course, out of politeness, they all stand up. And now they're up, well, they might as well start dancing. The wonderful sight of all the presidents dancing. Hey, we can let our hair down and enjoy ourselves. I just like that. I thought that was funny.
Gosh.
Very funny.
Yes. Well, it's not like that anymore, is it? You don't get that sort of thing happening at the NATO conference.
Certainly not.
Is that your lot, Mr. Pike?
That's my lot, yeah.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you very much. Just, do you have anything at all for us?
Yes, I've got two things. First, taking us back in time, and the other bringing us up right up to date. So, first is 1969, the 27th of September, in melody maker Val Wilmer writes about Ornette Coleman, and she begins, "I'm imagining things, imagining for a moment that I've never heard of Ornette Coleman. Then someone turns up with, let's say, An Evening with Ornette Coleman and plonks it on the turntable. What would my reaction be? Some members of the establishment would still have us believe that the saxophonist is a musical freak, but show me the man who really loves jazz and wouldn't jump for joy at Ornette's happy urgency." And she writes a nice piece about his evolution musically and his placing him in context of other saxophonists and other jazz musicians, and concludes that Ornette is the man who bridged the gap between the conventional and the free. He is also, for me at any rate, the new Charlie Parker, whatever that means. I know of no one else playing jazz today who has the ability to make my heart sing so, which I just think is lovely. It's a lovely piece of writing. And obviously, as any regular listener to the podcast will know, I love Ornette. So I couldn't resist talking about that. Geoffrey, were you listening to much jazz in the 60s? What were your feelings about Ornette and et al?
No, I wasn't. I never listened to jazz. Not because I didn't want to. I wasn't interested.
You didn't want to because you weren't interested.
But the one thing I would like to mention, which we haven't discussed, is my part in the Glastonbury Festival. Because, as I mentioned, I knew Michael Eavis before the Glastonbury Festival started. And I encouraged him to start. I think I encouraged his idea of starting a festival because of what I said to him about the Dylan Festival in the Isle of Wight, which was the year before. And then the festival was taken over in 1971 and was the most important festival, I think, was the 1971 one, which, as I mentioned, had David Bowie playing and also had Gilberto Gil and Caetano Veloso playing, but also made the link with Glastonbury as a mystical place.
Yes,
and was altogether different from when Michael Eavis took it over the year after. But I would encourage people to access the 1971 festival. It was wonderful.
Are you still in touch with Michael Eavis?
Oh yes, he's a long-standing friend.
Yes,
I visited him last in the UK 5 years ago, and he's wonderful. But his account of how it all started is not altogether accurate. I know that because of talking to him the year before when I visited him with my 3 children, young children, that I encouraged him to start a festival.
You heard it here first.
The last piece that I'd like to mention is from last year. So, as I said, coming forward in time into a very different music industry than the one we've been talking about. And it's Ludovic Hunter-Tilney writing in the Financial Times on the 14th of June, 2025, about James Blake, who he's interviewing. And the headline is, "James Blake is taking on TikTok, Live Nation, and quote-unquote free music." Piece begins, "Sad boy music was how Pitchfork once caricatured the British singer-songwriter's sound. It's like the opposite of punk, isn't it?" he said jokingly in 2016 while discussing his influence on other musicians. "I've subdued a generation." But Blake is not so quiescent after all. Last year, in March, he launched a volley of tweets and Instagram posts lambasting streaming platforms, tech companies, and record labels for exploiting musicians. "The brainwashing worked, and now people think music is free," he tweeted during his outburst. The trigger for Blake's ire was an Instagram post bemoaning the onus on musicians to make TikTok videos rather than music. "It just made me very angry," Blake says. "I remember thinking, I cannot believe we're here. Imagine the Smiths or Joy Division making TikToks to promote their music. Think about Nick Cave or Joni Mitchell, and just imagine them negotiating with this bullshit." So it's a fascinating interview to read because, you know, James Blake is not only a great musician but a very interesting man, and he's reflecting on the whole role of the musician within the music industry. And he says, "The myth I'd like to dispel is that creativity is somehow hampered by thinking about business," he says. "The unfortunate story of the industry is of musicians focusing on music while other people do all the other stuff. Those days are over. The days of just holing away in a studio and never thinking about money. We're just not living in that time." And, you know, I think that's interesting and quite sad if you take his viewpoint that it's no longer possible to just be a musician. But I thought it made an interesting contrast to the freedom of the 60s and 70s we've been talking about.
Great. Fantastic. So that brings us to the end of episode 231 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. Wow. Many thanks to Geoffrey Cannon for talking to us about his early years as a pioneering rock writer for New Society, The Listener, and of course The Guardian. Do follow our podcast on whichever platforms you use, and please consider subscribing to Rock's Back Pages itself. We will be back in a fortnight with Tim Page, former music critic of the Washington Post. I don't know if there's a theme here, critics of national newspapers. Anyway, Tim will be joining us. And on that note, it's farewell from us and from our guest, Geoffrey.
The one thing I want to say is that Rock's Back Pages is wonderful, and your commitment to it for all these years is a very important.
Well, thank you very much, Geoffrey.
Well done, Barney.
That's absolutely lovely. Maybe we can use that as the station ident, Jasper, or something like that. But we'll just do a little sing-along goodbye. You can join in if the mood takes you, Geoffrey. So all together now. Goodbye.
That concludes episode 231 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to special guest Geoffrey Cannon. Find his music writing on Rock's Back Pages. Those to Barney Hoskins and William Pike, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Murison Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews, at rocksbackpages.com.